always looking for bargains, and when I find one, I'll go right from work to pick it up.
It's the tea you can really taste.
Smash, get smash.
Do you remember those cheapest grocery items? The ones that made a tight budget stretch just far enough to feed everyone? In the 1970s supermarket, these foods filled pantries and bellies when paychecks barely covered rent. But looking back now, how did we make so much from so little? Bulk rice in paper sacks was a staple that never ran out. You bought it in big brown bags, plain, no pictures, just a weight and a price. It sat in the pantry like a promise, always there when the fridge looked bare. You measured it by the cup, cooked it in a dented pot, and served it under just about everything. When there was meat, rice stretched it. When there was no meat, rice was enough. You rinsed it in a strainer that was slightly bent, watching cloudy water swirl down the sink. Sometimes it bubbled over and made a mess, but no one got mad. It meant dinner was almost ready. You learned to measure it without thinking. 1 part rice to 2 parts water, just like Mom said. Leftovers went into the fridge in stained plastic containers, ready for another meal tomorrow. Sometimes it was fried with onions and eggs, sometimes just reheated with a splash of broth. It was plain, but never boring. Not when you were hungry. Rice didn't ask for much, and it gave back everything. Sometimes it stuck to the bottom of the pan. Sometimes it came out perfect. Either way, you ate it. It was cheap, filling, and impossible to ruin beyond saving. With a little margarine and salt, it tasted like comfort. You could make a whole meal out of it if you had to. Rice with beans, rice with canned gravy, rice with whatever leftovers were still good. You did not think of it as poor food. You thought of it as normal. The bag might tear if it sat too long, so you kept it clipped shut with a clothespin, because every grain counted. In the 1970s, bulk rice was not a trend. It was survival wrapped in brown paper. Canned pork and beans were a meal, a side dish, and a backup plan all in one. You bought them by the case, stacked the cans in the pantry, and knew you were covered for at least a week. They were soft, sweet, and strangely satisfying. Thick sauce, tender beans, and tiny bits of pork if you got lucky. Sometimes it was 1 chunk of pork per can, but it made you feel like it counted. You heated them on the stove or ate them cold when time or patience ran out. Served over toast, beside hot dogs, or just in a bowl with a spoon, they got the job done. You could dress them up or leave them as they were. Either way, they filled you up. They stuck to your ribs and stained your plate, but you cleaned it with a piece of bread. There were no rules about how to serve them, just instincts and whatever else was on hand. Sometimes you added mustard or onions, trying to change things up. Other times, you were too hungry to bother. Kids ate them without question. Adults relied on them without pride. The label was always familiar, even when the brand changed. They were warm. They were cheap. They were always there. Nobody called it fancy, but nobody went hungry either. In a time when grocery bills had to stretch, this little can was one of the best returns on $1 you could ask for. Pork and beans were the taste of getting through it, and somehow they stuck around because they worked. Canned chicken or turkey, store brand of course, was not about flavor. It was about feeding your family fast and cheap. You opened the can and got a mound of shredded meat floating in mystery broth. You drained it, fluffed it with a fork, and hoped the salt and spices would do the rest. It was perfect for sandwiches, casseroles, and anything involving cream of something soup. It did not taste like fresh meat, but it didn't need to. It was meat, and that was enough. You could stretch 1 can across an entire pot of noodles, and nobody complained. It made a good filling for pot pie when the freezer had nothing else to offer. You might mix in mayo and onions or eat it plain on toast if it was one of those weeks. It wasn't juicy, it wasn't tender, but it was protein, and it mattered. Some folks turned their nose up at it, but most kept a few cans in the back of the cupboard. It might not have had flavor, but it had purpose. In the 1970s, meat was a luxury, and canned versions were a compromise that kept dinner from falling apart. You could mix it with noodles, rice, or even top it on saltines when you were short on bread. It came through when nothing else did. No one raved about it, but they were always glad it was there. Canned poultry may have been humble, but it filled plates, filled sandwiches, and filled that space in the cupboard labeled just in case. Canned corned beef hash was salty, soft, and a little strange, but it fed you well. You cracked the lid, heard the suction break, and slid out a solid block of meat and potatoes. It looked like dog food and smelled like breakfast, and somehow it worked. You'd fry it in a skillet until it crisped on the edges and serve it with eggs, if you had eggs. If not, it stood on its own, greasy and rich and completely satisfying. There was no guessing what was in it. You just trusted that it was meat and starch and enough to hold you till dinner. You flipped it carefully so it didn't fall apart. Sometimes it stuck to the pan and you scraped it up anyway. It hissed in the skillet and filled the house with the kind of smell that said, "There's food on the stove." Leftovers went into sandwiches, folded into omelets, or straight into a bowl with ketchup. It was versatile because it had to be, and filling because it needed to be. You might not have liked how it looked, but you never argued with how it made you feel. Some people added onions or ketchup, others just let it sizzle. It tasted better than it looked. And on mornings when the cupboard was close to empty, corned beef hash reminded you that a can opener and a hot pan could still mean a good meal. In the 1970s, it was one of the cheapest ways to feel like you were eating something hearty, and it stuck with you. Economy pancake mix came in a cardboard box and gave you more than just breakfast. It was pancakes, waffles, biscuits, even dumplings if you knew how to stretch it. You just added water, sometimes milk if you had it, and mixed until the lumps mostly disappeared. The batter was thin, the pancakes were uneven, but they were warm and they were real. You poured syrup if you had it, jelly if you didn't, and ate them hot off the griddle or cold out of the fridge. They stuck to your ribs and gave you a reason to sit down at the table. Some days it was the only hot thing you ate. You learned to flip them just right, even with a bent spatula and an uneven burner. Some came out burnt, others undercooked, but you ate them all. They filled your plate and quieted your stomach, and that was what mattered. On Sundays, you made extra and saved them in the fridge like treasure. You might roll them up with butter and sugar, or just fold and eat them like a taco. It didn't matter what you called them. If it came from that box, it was breakfast. They were never fancy, but they filled the room with that unmistakable smell that made everything feel okay for a minute. In the 1970s, a box of pancake mix was more than a shortcut. It was a way to turn nothing into something. Economy pancake mix didn't just save breakfast, it saved mornings. Macaroni and cheese in a box was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, everyone had that orange powder in the cupboard. Boil the pasta, drain it, and stir in butter, milk, and the neon dust. It was dinner in minutes. Some added extras. Most just ate it as is, because it was fast, cheap, and somehow comforting. The cheese sauce was barely cheese, but you loved it anyway. You scraped the pot with a wooden spoon until there was nothing left to lick. Sometimes you added hot dogs, peas, or canned tuna to make it stretch. You never read the directions. You just made it the way your family always had. Even when it clumped or turned runny, it still tasted like home. It filled the kitchen with a smell that said, "You're going to be okay tonight." Kids asked for seconds, and there was rarely enough for leftovers. It stuck to the spoon, clung to the bowl, and stained your tongue if you ate enough of it. In the 1970s, boxed mac and cheese was how you made sure the kids ate something hot, even when the fridge was almost empty. It was shelf-stable, kid-friendly, and budget-approved. Nobody cared that it was not real cheese. They cared that it was there when you needed it. Mac and cheese from a box was not just food. It was a plan that always worked. Saltine crackers were never the star, but they were always in the picture. The box lasted forever, and the sleeves got stale faster than you could finish them. But you kept them anyway. They were there when the bread ran out, there when you were sick, there when dinner needed a filler. You spread peanut butter, dipped them in soup, crumbled them into meatloaf. Dry and plain and dusty on your tongue, but still, somehow, comforting. You lined them up on a plate like a snack tray when there was nothing else to serve. They broke easily in your hand, but never let you down in a recipe. Sometimes they were the only side dish on the table. You crunched them late at night when the house was quiet and your stomach was not. No one ever thanked them, but no one ever threw them out either. They lived at the back of every pantry like a safety net made of salt and starch. You wrapped them in napkins and tucked them in lunchboxes like they were gold. Sometimes dinner was just a few saltines and whatever you could scrounge. They held everything together, even when everything felt like it was falling apart. Saltines were not fancy. They were just always there. Dry egg noodles in cellophane bags were the unsung hero of the pantry. You could get a whole bag for less than $1, and they could turn into just about anything. They boiled fast, held sauce well, and didn't need anything but a little margarine and salt to be considered dinner. If you had canned soup, they went in. If you had leftover meat, they soaked it up. They were soft, simple, and endlessly forgiving. You didn't read recipes, you cooked by feel, by habit, by hunger, and somehow those plain old noodles came out just right. They were the background singer in 100 family dinners. You could stretch them over multiple nights or serve them all at once when company came by. Sometimes you buttered them with pepper and called it done. Other times you baked them into casseroles that fed a crowd. They were bland, yes, but also blank, ready for anything. No one praised the noodles, but no one left the table hungry. In the 1970s, this was your food safety net, cheap, filling, and flexible. Dry egg noodles were not a luxury, but they were a lifeline. Canned beets or carrots were not anyone's favorite, but they made the plate look complete. You opened the can, drained the liquid, and served them straight, or maybe warmed them in a little butter. They were soft, too soft sometimes, but you ate them anyway, because in the 1970s, getting vegetables meant buying what you could afford, not what looked best. They added color, nutrition, and just enough balance to a meal made of starch and meat. You did not love them, but you learned to work with them. You mashed them into other dishes when the kids refused to touch them. You glazed them with sugar and crossed your fingers they would pass for something better. Some cans were tastier than others, depending on the brand and the batch. The smell when you opened them was never great, but it faded fast. You knew they were overcooked, but at least they were cooked. They rounded out a meal that might otherwise be missing something green or orange. A little sugar for the beets, a little brown sugar for the carrots. They weren't perfect, but they were enough. Canned vegetables filled the gap between what you wanted and what you had, and they did it quietly. Canned tomato paste was not something you ate on its own, but it was in everything. You added a spoonful to soup, to sauce, to anything that needed depth on a budget. It was thick, dark, and so concentrated it stained your fingertips. One little can could stretch a meal for 6. You learned to scrape every last bit from the corners with a spoon. It was the base of spaghetti night, chili, casseroles, even homemade ketchup. When fresh tomatoes were too expensive, tomato paste stepped in without complaint. You mixed it with a bit of sugar to cut the bitterness. Sometimes you watered it down and pretended it was marinara. You knew it was a shortcut, but it never felt like cheating. A can of tomato paste gave dinner a backbone, even when the ingredients were bare. It lived in the back of the cupboard, waiting quietly for its turn. No one ever praised it, but nothing tasted right without it. In the 1970s, that tiny can held more than just flavor. It held possibility. Tomato paste was how you made cheap food taste like you tried. Economy bacon ends, and pieces were not pretty, but they were still bacon. You did not get neat strips. You got chunks, scraps, and the fatty leftovers that stores could not sell any other way. But they were smoky, salty, and cheap. You cooked them slow to melt the fat, then saved the grease for later. They popped and sizzled and filled the kitchen with the smell of something special. You chopped them into beans, stirred them into scrambled eggs, or sprinkled them over a potato to make it feel like more. Sometimes they were mostly fat. Sometimes you got a good piece. But every bite counted. You knew exactly what to do with them, even if no recipe ever called for them. They made Sunday breakfast feel a little more like a celebration. You could stretch a single handful across 3 meals if you played it right. Even the drippings were sacred. You saved every drop in an old coffee can. They crisped up in a cast iron pan better than anything else. They weren't made for photo spreads. They were made for survival. Every greasy splatter on the stove was proof that you had something hot on the table. They were greasy and irregular and absolutely necessary. In a time when full strips cost too much, bacon ends were how you kept the flavor without the price. You did not care what it looked like. You cared what it did. Economy bacon ends were not about presentation. They were about making breakfast feel like a win. Plain yellow mustard was the flavor that kept on giving. It cost almost nothing, lasted forever, and made even the driest sandwich feel like it had something going for it. You slathered it on white bread with lunch meat or just a slice of cheese. Sometimes just mustard and bread was the whole sandwich. It was sharp, tangy, and completely unmistakable. It made hot dogs feel complete, perked up meatloaf, and gave leftovers a second chance. The jar or squeeze bottle sat in the fridge door like an old friend, always there, always useful. You never needed much, just a little bit to cut through the bland. It lit up potato salad, deviled eggs, and even the crust of a grilled cheese. You never ran out completely. There was always some hiding in the back. You could stretch it through summer barbecues and winter sandwiches alike. Even when you were out of almost everything, you usually had mustard. It stained your fingers, your clothes, and sometimes your plastic plates, but you forgave it. Its tang made you feel like you were eating something bold, even when the rest was basic. And no one ever judged you for leaning on it, because they did too. It might not have been fancy, but mustard pulled more weight in a 1970s kitchen than people gave it credit for. It was cheap, bright, and honest. And sometimes, that was exactly what dinner needed. Bouillon cubes were tiny blocks of magic that turned water into soup. You dropped one into a pot, stirred, and suddenly had broth. It was salty, concentrated, and packed with more flavor than you expected. You used it to stretch a can of soup, to season rice, or to make gravy when there was no meat. It lived in the back of the spice cabinet, usually wrapped in foil and a little bit dusty. You never used just one. You always added a second for good measure. It was your secret weapon when there was nothing but starch and hope in the kitchen. A cube in hot water meant something warm to sip, something to pour over instant potatoes, something that felt like more than it was. It gave canned vegetables more life. It made casseroles taste like they simmered all day. You crumbled it with your fingers when the knife drawer was already a mess. It was small enough to forget, but big enough to save dinner. You could buy a dozen cubes for less than $1, and they kept for years. It was comfort concentrated into a foil wrapper. No one talked about it, but everyone used it. Bouillon was not glamorous, but it knew its place and served it well. Bouillon was not a meal, but it made a meal feel like it had a soul. In the 1970s, it was how you gave dinner a backbone, one cube at a time. Economy-size bags of popcorn kernels were the go-to snack when the cupboard was looking thin. One giant bag could last for weeks, maybe longer. You popped it in oil on the stove, no microwave, no fancy machines, just a pot, a lid, and the sound of hope. The kernels jumped, hissed, and turned into fluffy handfuls of salty comfort. Sometimes you burned the bottom layer, sometimes you nailed it. You salted it heavy, added a little margarine if you had it, and served it up in bowls or paper bags. It was movie night food, after-school food, or just something to fill the gap between meals. You made it by feel, counting the seconds between pops with your ear to the lid. You knew just how much oil to use, even without a measuring spoon. Sometimes you added sugar and made kettle corn before you even knew what kettle corn was. It fed a whole group of kids for the cost of one box of cereal. Even the unpopped kernels were kept, just in case you could try again. You burned your fingers more than once reaching into the pot too soon. The smell filled the house and drew people in like magic. And somehow that bag always lasted longer than you thought it would. It cost less than $1, and somehow it felt like a treat. Popcorn kernels were proof that something simple could still feel special. Boxed cornflakes, store brand of course, were breakfast on a budget. They came in plain boxes with boring fonts and nothing inside but the flakes and maybe some cereal dust. They were crunchy for the first 30 seconds, then turned soggy if you were too slow. You poured sugar on them if you could. Otherwise, you powered through. They were not exciting, but they were consistent. You ate them dry, you crushed them into meatloaf, and you used them as filler when the good cereal ran out. No mascots, no games on the back of the box, just cereal that did what it needed to do. You reused the box for school projects, wrapping paper, or organizing drawers. The bag inside was always noisy and impossible to open cleanly. You knew the bottom half would be mostly crumbs, but you kept going. They sat high on the pantry shelf because no one ever snuck them for a midnight snack. They were bland, honest, and there for you when sweeter cereals vanished too fast. Sometimes you mixed them with another cereal just to give them a second chance. No one asked for them, but no one threw them away. Cornflakes taught you that reliable food is underrated. They were plain, honest food in a world that demanded you stretch every dollar. Boxed cornflakes did not make you feel rich, but they did make sure you were fed. Store-brand mayonnaise in giant jars was a staple that showed up in everything. It lived in the fridge, thick and white and slightly tangy, always ready to do the heavy lifting. You mixed it with tuna, with egg, with potatoes, with anything that needed binding. The jar seemed to last forever, one heaping spoonful at a time. It was not fancy, but it worked. You could tell how long it had been in the fridge by how hard the lid was to open. When it got low, you scraped the sides with a spoon until there was nothing left. Sometimes it separated a little, and you stirred it back like it was no big deal. You did not think about what was in it. You just knew it made things taste better. And when the name brands were too expensive, this jar kept showing up to save the day. Sometimes it was too oily, sometimes too thick, but you learned to stir, scrape, and stretch. It made sandwiches feel finished, cold salads taste creamy, and leftover chicken seem like something new. In the 1970s, it was the glue that held half your recipes together. Store-brand mayo never tried to impress. It just showed up and did the job. Economy tea bags were the warm drink that felt like a small luxury. You could buy a box of 100 for a couple of bucks, and they would last through cold seasons and quiet evenings. You dunked them in hot water, let them steep, and drank it plain or with a little sugar if you had it. Sometimes you used the same bag twice, sometimes more. It was light, a little bitter, and deeply calming. Tea was not about caffeine, it was about comfort. The paper tags always tore off, so you fished the string out with a spoon. You held the mug in both hands like it could warm more than just your fingers. Even if it was lukewarm, it gave you a reason to slow down. You drank it at the table, on the couch, or leaning against the counter while the house was still. It was not about the tea. It was about the quiet that came with it. You drank it when you were sick, when you were tired, or when there was nothing else. The bag would float at the top, and you knew not to squeeze it too much or it would get bitter. Economy tea bags gave the day a sense of pause, even when everything else felt rushed. Baking soda in bulk boxes was not just for baking. It sat in the fridge to keep things fresh, under the sink for cleaning, and on the shelf in case a recipe called for it. You used it in biscuits, in pancakes, and in cookies when you got lucky enough to bake. A spoonful could lift a batter or scrub a sink. It never expired, never spoiled, and never let you down. The box was always just a little dusty, with the cardboard flap bent back from years of use. You tapped it into your hand because the opening never worked right. It fizzed when you added vinegar, and somehow that always felt like magic. You poured it down drains, into shoes, and over stovetops without thinking twice. There was always a box open somewhere in the house, half used but still useful. It was invisible help, quiet, cheap, and always ready. It was the kind of item that did not get talked about, but got used constantly. You bought it once and forgot about it, until you needed it again. In the 1970s, baking soda was the cheapest multi-tool in the kitchen. Frozen pie crust discs were your shortcut to something that felt homemade. They came stacked in twos, separated by paper, and wrapped in waxy plastic. You let them thaw on the counter and prayed they did not crack. Filled with canned fruit or leftover meat, they turned into dessert or dinner depending on the day. You pinched the edges, brushed the tops with a little milk, and baked until golden brown. They were flaky enough, forgiving enough, and always appreciated. You rolled them thinner if you needed to stretch them. If one tore, you patched it with your fingers and kept going. Sometimes they stuck to the pan, and you served them anyway. The smell of them baking made the house feel warmer, even in the middle of summer. No one asked if it came from scratch. They just said, "Thank you." Nobody cared that it came from the freezer. They cared that you made something with it. They saved you time, saved you ingredients, and gave you something to serve with pride. Frozen pie crusts were not homemade, but they still came from a place of care. Canned applesauce was dessert, side dish, and lunchbox filler all in one. It came in big cans, small cans, even plastic cups toward the end of the decade. It was smooth, sweet, and slightly tangy, and always better cold. You served it with pork chops, spooned it into bowls, or spread it on toast. Sometimes it was cinnamon-flavored, sometimes plain, but always familiar. It was fruit that required no peeling, no chewing, and no mess. You stirred it before serving because the water always rose to the top. It came out in a soft plop and sat in the bowl like a scoop of mashed fruit. It cooled your tongue after hot meals and added sweetness to otherwise dull plates. Sometimes it was the only thing on the plate that felt like dessert. You never got excited about it, but you always finished it. Kids loved it. Adults used it. It was dependable. Canned applesauce was one of those foods that never tried to do too much, but always gave just enough. Shelf-stable pudding cups or mixes were the little reward that did not ask for much. They sat on grocery shelves in rows, plastic cups sealed tight, or powder mixes packed into pouches you could forget about until dessert time rolled around. You didn't need a refrigerator to keep them good. You didn't need fresh milk to make them right, just some warm water and patience. They were the desserts you packed in lunches when real treats were out of reach. Chocolate, vanilla, butterscotch, nothing fancy, but all sweet, smooth, and just enough to feel like you were getting away with something. They made you feel cared for, even when the cupboards were low. A cold pudding cup at the end of a bologna sandwich lunch was the kind of small joy that carried more weight than you realized. You peeled the foil lid slowly, hoping for a clean break, and licked it like it mattered. And it did. Sometimes the mix came in boxes that needed stirring, chilling, waiting. You had to plan ahead, but it was worth it when the pan came out firm and jiggling. Pudding was not about decadence. It was about making the best of what you had and making it feel special. In the 1970s, a pudding cup in your lunchbox or a slice from the fridge meant more than sugar. It meant someone remembered you liked dessert. Tapioca pudding mix was weird, lumpy, and kind of magical. You had to cook it on the stovetop, stirring until it thickened, until the little pearls of starch turned from hard beads into soft, chewy bubbles suspended in a sweet, creamy base. It was not instant. It was not quick, but it made the house smell like something was happening. It took time, attention, and a gentle hand at the stove, and that made it feel important. You could eat it warm or cold, with a sprinkle of cinnamon or a dollop of jam if you had it. It was texture more than taste, and once you got used to it, you never forgot it. Some kids loved it, others swore it off forever. But it stuck in your memory either way. The box was cheap, the servings were plenty, and the leftovers, if there were any, tasted even better the next day. Tapioca pudding was the kind of dessert that showed up quietly, without celebration, but gave you the comfort of something homemade when money said otherwise. In the 1970s, this was the pudding that took its time, and reminded you to slow down too. Boxed gelatin mix, store brand, no frills, was the dessert you made when there was not enough for anything else. It cost pennies, took only water, and could sit in the fridge for days without going bad. Red, orange, lime green, it all tasted mostly the same. But that did not matter. It was cold, wiggly, sweet, and strangely satisfying. You poured it into mismatched bowls, let it set, and waited for that first satisfying spoonful. It was something you could offer guests and still feel like a good host. It filled space at birthday parties, potlucks, and school lunches. You could stretch it with canned fruit or whipped topping, turn it into a salad if you wanted to get fancy, or just eat it straight. Sometimes you made it just because you needed to feel like something was under control. It set slowly in the fridge, and for a few hours, you had something to look forward to. Gelatin mix did not impress anyone, but it held its place. Colorful, sweet, and just enough to count as dessert. Store-brand peanut butter crackers were the kind of snack that showed up when lunch was still a few hours away. They came in little plastic sleeves, bright orange crackers, sandwiching a thin layer of slightly sweet, slightly salty peanut butter. You could buy a box of 6-packs for under $1, and they lasted all week if you were careful. They were crumbly, dry, and left peanut butter in the corners of your mouth. But you never said no to them. They were the treat tucked into a lunchbox when cookies were out of reach. You ate them slow, one bite at a time, trying to make them last, or you scarfed them down fast because hunger had no patience. Some broke in the package. Some were perfect, but everyone counted. They were the in-between snack that got you through school days, grocery trips, or waiting for dinner to be done. You never thought of them as luxury, but looking back, they were one of the most dependable little things in your pantry. Peanut butter crackers did not make a meal, but they gave you just enough to keep going. Plain white rice pudding cups were the quiet dessert no one bragged about, but everyone seemed to eat. They came chilled, sealed with foil, and tasted like soft, sweetened memory. They were thick, creamy, and filled with tiny grains of rice that reminded you food did not have to be loud to be good. It was the kind of dessert that made you sit down, take a spoon, and actually pay attention. The cinnamon on top, when it was there, added just enough to make it feel like something made with care. You never asked for rice pudding, but when it was there, you always ate it. Some came from the store in those little 4-packs wrapped in cardboard. Others came from home, made from leftover rice and sweetened milk, poured into Tupperware. It was humble, but it was honest. And it reminded you that dessert did not have to be perfect, it just had to be present. It filled the space between meals with warmth. It closed the night on a soft note. Rice pudding cups did not sparkle, but in the 1970s, they delivered comfort without trying too hard, and sometimes that was exactly what we needed. Day-old bread was a hidden treasure hunt, if you knew where to look. Your mom had a favorite shop. It was not a bakery. It was the day-old bread store. Shelves of discounted loaves, bent buns, and broken bagels lined up like misfit toys. You grabbed what you could: white bread, wheat bread, hamburger rolls with one smashed side. You had to check for mold, sure, but you also found surprises: honey wheat, raisin swirl, hot dog buns in winter. The smell was amazing. The prices were even better. You could get 5 loaves for the cost of 1. At home, you froze most of it, ate the rest fast, toasted it, buttered it, grilled it. If it was dry, you made it into stuffing. If it was too far gone, it became breadcrumbs. Nothing was wasted. The bread store was not fancy, but it kept your lunchbox full. And in the 1970s, full was all that mattered. If you grew up in the 1970s, chances are you either had a birthday at Shakey's Pizza or knew someone who did. This was not just another pizza place. It was a full-on experience. Walk in and you were met with the clatter of trays, the smell of garlic, and live banjo music that made you feel like you had wandered into a Western saloon. With pepperoni. Shakey's was loud, a little chaotic, and totally perfect for families. Communal tables meant you might be sitting next to someone you had never met before, and that was part of the fun. You shared space, laughter, and slices of that crispy, thin crust pizza that somehow always had the perfect crunch. Add in pitchers of root beer or beer depending on your age, and it was a celebration from start to finish. This was not date night pizza. This was messy, saucy, no-frills fun. You were not there to be quiet. You were there to have a good time. And if you were lucky, you might catch a glimpse of the kitchen through the glass, giant dough balls being tossed, toppings flying, ovens glowing. It was the kind of place that kids adored and parents tolerated. But deep down, everyone left full and happy. Because no matter how much sauce ended up on your shirt or how many quarters you spent at the arcade machine, it all added up to memories. Shakey's was not built for subtlety. It was built for joy, noise, and big tables filled with people who just wanted a slice and a good time. And in the 1970s, it nailed that mission like nobody else. The camera and film shop was a cathedral of forgotten technology. You walked in, and the air smelled like chemicals and time. Behind the counter, rows of yellow Kodak envelopes waited like tiny mysteries. Dad would head straight for the slide carousel projectors, lifting one like it was a sacred artifact. Kodachrome, he would whisper. They just don't make colors like that anymore. You did not know what he meant, but you believed it. You spun the projector just to hear the satisfying click, click, click of slides falling into place. There were shelves of lenses, tripods, flash bulbs in boxes older than you, and glass cases of second-hand cameras that looked more like museum pieces. Dad talked shop with the clerk, dropping words like aperture and ISO like he was reading from scripture. You picked up a Polaroid and tried to figure out how it worked. The clerk let you snap one. The photo came out blurry, overexposed, but it still felt like magic. Dad bought a roll of film, maybe 2, even though he already had 6 at home. Just in case, he would say, just in case the light hit right. And on the drive home, with the bag of film in his lap, he would say, "One quick stop." That stop? A smoky little pool hall where you got a taste of grown-up cool, even if just for one night. Leisure World was not just a retirement community, it was a promise, a dream built on sunshine, shuffleboard, and stress-free living. Born in the 1970s, Leisure World offered gated bliss for seniors, condos, golf carts, social clubs, and security. It was pitched as paradise for the golden years. But paradise costs money. And by the 1980s, cracks started to show. Economic downturns hit retirement savings hard. Fixed incomes did not match rising maintenance fees. And some residents found that the dream came with hidden rules, strict covenants, and unexpected costs. The promise of simplicity turned into a maze of fine print. For many residents, retirement began to feel like a contract they never meant to sign. Lawsuits followed, disputes over control, access, and promises made but not kept. What began as a utopia turned, in many places, into something colder. Today, some Leisure World communities still exist, but the shine is gone. The brochures have aged. The palm trees are the same, but the illusion has faded. For many, it is still home. But for others, it was a broken promise wrapped in sunshine. A reminder that even dreams built in good faith can crack under real pressure. Chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, and aerosol sprays were in everything from your mom's hairspray to your dad's deodorant, and back then, nobody thought twice about it. You'd hold the can, press the nozzle, and hear that satisfying pshht as a cloud of product filled the bathroom like a fog machine. It was all part of the routine: style, spray, suffocate. The scent lingered, the mist settled, and somewhere high above the earth, the ozone layer took another hit. CFCs were hailed as miracle propellants, but they were also silent saboteurs, breaking down ozone molecules and letting ultraviolet radiation pour in. It wasn't until scientists noticed a literal hole forming over Antarctica that the alarm bells rang, and suddenly the hairspray that made your bangs defy gravity didn't seem so harmless anymore. By the late 1980s, global treaties stepped in, banning or phasing out CFCs in favor of safer alternatives. Today's aerosol cans may still mist, but they don't punch holes in the sky. Still, if we're talking about scents that stuck around, sometimes in your nostrils, sometimes in your brain, the next culprit was in your pencil box. Schiaparelli perfumes once lived in the same breathless league as Chanel and Dior. With their surrealist bottles and bold floral compositions, they brought high fashion to the dressing tables of everyday American women. It was not just a scent, it was a statement. In the 1970s, Schiaparelli's legacy still lingered, but America was shifting. Fashion was getting younger, louder, and more synthetic. The brand struggled to adapt. Department stores gave shelf space to trendier, punchier names. The old-world elegance of Schiaparelli felt out of step in a decade of disco and denim. And somewhere along the way, the company let go of its American foothold. Licensing fell apart. Distribution waned. What had once been a symbol of European sophistication became something whispered about in vintage shops. Women who once dabbed it on before dinner parties now found their favorite scents discontinued, forgotten. For some, it was just a bottle, but for others, it was identity. A sense of self wrapped in rose and bergamot, and losing that, quietly, without warning, felt like losing a part of the woman they once were. Generic peanut butter was a gamble, but you took it. It came in a tan jar with a white label that said peanut butter and nothing else. No cartoon bears, no crunchy option. Just oil on top, cement on the bottom, and a knife stuck somewhere in between. You stirred until your hand ached. You scraped and scooped. You tasted it and blinked twice. It was bitter. It was bland. But it was peanut butter, and peanut butter meant sandwiches. You smeared it on stale bread and added jelly if you had it. Sometimes just sugar, sometimes nothing. It stuck to the roof of your mouth and stayed there. But it kept you full until dinner. It did not spread well, and it never looked appetizing. But it filled a sandwich with calories, and that was the only thing that mattered. It was cheaper than the name brand and lasted longer too, mostly because no one was sneaking spoonfuls when mom was not looking. You brought it to school in a paper bag and traded it if you were lucky. But even if nobody wanted it, you still ate every bite, because it was food, and in the 1970s that was enough. Before the controversy caught up with it, Sambo's was everywhere, and for a time in the 1970s, it was one of the biggest names in breakfast. Open early, often late, and always ready with a stack of pancakes dripping in syrup. It was the kind of place families stopped at on the way to road trips or for Saturday mornings that started a little too early. The vibe was laid back, kid-friendly, and comfortable. Bright booths, illustrated menus, and pancakes that somehow tasted better when eaten with plastic syrup containers shaped like bears. The food was affordable, the service was fast, and the portions were just shy of excessive, which is exactly what breakfast lovers wanted. Their branding leaned hard on storytelling, and while the original theme is undeniably problematic today, it reflected a different time when restaurants leaned into mascots and backstories to create an identity. But for a lot of kids back then, it was just the place where they got chocolate chip pancakes and a chocolate milk with a swirly straw. And the thing is, the food held its own. The pancakes were genuinely good. The eggs were reliable. The hash browns were crispy, and the coffee was hot, which is all anyone really asks of a breakfast joint. At its peak, Sambo's was not just a restaurant. It was part of the morning routine for countless families, the kind of place you returned to because it felt like a tradition. And while its legacy is a complicated one, there is no denying that for a few years in the 1970s, Sambo's helped define what going out for breakfast looked like across America. The used bookstore with the ham radios in the back was the kind of place where time folded in on itself. You walked in and the smell hit you first. Paper, dust, and something that might have been pipe smoke from 50 years ago. Dad would head for the nonfiction section like it was a treasure map, and you would start flipping through comics that had long-forgotten characters in them. Every wall was covered in books, stacked too deep, sometimes sideways, sometimes just crammed in with no regard for order. But the real secret was in the back room. That was where the ham radios lived. Static buzzed from old speakers, and every now and then a voice would crackle through saying something like, "Calling from Connecticut. Do you copy?" Dad would nod slowly, say, "Nice rig," and start talking shop with the owner like they were part of some invisible club. You never understood a word of it, but it felt cool anyway, like your dad knew something no one else did. He would pick up a radio, fiddle with a dial, and say, "This one's got personality." The man behind the counter always nodded like that meant something. But if you thought that place had character, wait until you see Dad at the county auction barn, outbidding strangers for a box of who knows what. W.T. Grant was not just a department store, it was a part of the American landscape. In the 1970s, it had over 1,000 locations, main streets, suburban malls, strip centers. W.T. Grant was everywhere. It sold clothes, appliances, hardware, school supplies. You could buy a pair of jeans, a toaster, and a lawn chair in one trip. But behind the counters, trouble brewed. Management wanted growth, and they wanted it fast. Stores were built too quickly. Debt piled up. And worst of all, They handed out credit like candy. Their revolving charge account let customers buy now, pay later, with no real system to check if they could afford it. The trust they gave customers was generous, but fatally blind. W.T. Grant did not just run out of money, it ran out of time. The losses mounted. In 1976, W.T. Grant filed for bankruptcy. It was one of the largest retail collapses in American history. Thousands of workers lost jobs, communities lost familiar storefronts, and shoppers lost a place that felt like home. Unlike other stores that faded quietly, Grant's collapse was loud, public, and painful. It was a warning shot across the bow of American retail. Grow too fast, trust too much, and the walls will fall. People still remember the logo, the way the floors creaked, the smell of new shoes in a cardboard box. But the store itself is gone. Spray fixative for art containing benzene gave every elementary art class that weird industrial edge. If you ever made a charcoal sketch or pastel masterpiece, chances are someone gave it a glossy finish with a fixative spray that doubled as a mini chemical hazard. The stuff smelled strong, like sharp varnish and nail polish remover had a baby, and teachers would often wave their hands around it saying, "Don't breathe too much of this in." But in rooms with no ventilation, that was easier said than done. Benzene was the key ingredient in many of those sprays, prized for its quick-drying power and ability to seal artwork without smudging. But what wasn't advertised on the can? Benzene is highly flammable, causes bone marrow suppression, and has been definitively linked to leukemia. Art classes were basically low-grade hazmat zones. Eventually, safer alternatives were developed, and benzene was restricted or banned from most consumer products. Still, the damage lingered. For many kids, the smell of creativity was also the smell of chemical exposure. And while we're on the topic of childhood routines, let's talk about the daily boiling ritual that now sounds downright medieval. Burger Chef once had more locations than McDonald's. That is the part people forget. Before the Golden Arches took over every highway exit and downtown corner, Burger Chef was America's fast food sweetheart. Its secret? The fun meal, a direct precursor to the Happy Meal. It gave kids toys, games, and branded packaging years before anyone else did. The burgers were solid, the prices were right, and families loved it. But then came the lawsuits, the missteps, the slow bleed of bad business decisions. Hardee's bought them out, closed down locations, and erased the name almost overnight. Some buildings stayed standing for years, sun-faded signs above cracked pavement. You would drive past them and remember the taste, the toy, the tray that made you feel like the meal was yours. What happened to Burger Chef was not just corporate takeover, it was theft by attrition, a slow-motion forgetting of something that once mattered. Ask anyone over 50 if they remember it, and their eyes light up. But there are no new stories being made. No drive-thrus, no jingles, no future, just memories. And that, for a brand that once brought so much joy, feels like a tragedy no one saw coming. Canned Spam was the meat that needed no fridge and barely needed a reason. You popped the lid with a key or your finger and slid out a jelly-covered block of mystery. You sliced it thin, fried it hard, and drowned it in mustard. It was salty, greasy, and so processed it almost squeaked. But it was meat. It filled sandwiches. It topped rice. It bulked up macaroni. You flipped it like pancakes on a hot skillet and called it dinner. Some people said it was gross. Others called it a lifesaver. You probably called it fine. It was not your favorite, but it was there when you were hungry. Spam came in food boxes, sat on sale shelves, and stayed in pantries for months. It was cheap, it was shelf-stable, and it worked. That was the whole point. You were not buying sirloin. You were feeding 4 people with 1 can. It showed up at family breakfasts and potluck casseroles. Some people hated it. Others made it a tradition. But if you were broke in the 1970s, Spam was meat, and that was enough. Now let us cool things down a little and talk about Swenson's. Just saying the name might make you crave something sweet. Swenson's was not just an ice cream shop. It was an event. Bright colors, vintage vibes, and menus that looked more like storybooks than food listings. Every Sunday had a name, and every name came with a little magic. It was the place you went after Little League games, family dinners, or just because it was Tuesday and you wanted a treat. Swenson's had that old-fashioned charm, but never felt out of date. Maybe it was the way the whipped cream swirled just right, or the cherry perched perfectly on top. But whatever it was, it worked. Banana splits, hot fudge sundaes, ice cream sodas. They were not trying to be healthy. They were trying to be happy. And it showed. Each visit felt like a reward. A place where kids could feel like royalty for a few minutes, and adults could remember what it felt like to just enjoy dessert without guilt or green juice. And you better believe the staff leaned into the theme. Uniforms, big smiles, the whole 9 yards. It was not fast food. It was ice cream theater. Every scoop was a little show and everyone left smiling. There are fewer Swensons around today, but their memory is still scooped into our minds. They were more than a sweet stop. They were a reason to leave the house. In a time when entertainment did not come from a screen in your pocket, Swenson's gave you a reason to look up, order something colorful, and just enjoy the moment. There were no signs, no trails, and definitely no cell reception. Not that it mattered. The hidden fishing hole Dad always took you to might as well have been a secret passed down through generations. You had to park on a dirt shoulder, hop a barbed wire fence, and walk through brush that snagged at your socks like it wanted you to turn back. But then, there it was. A quiet patch of water framed by trees and pure silence. No people, just frogs, the buzz of dragonflies, and the occasional splash of something just out of sight. Dad would hand you a rod, already rigged, and say, "Let's see if they're biting today," like it was a ritual. He always had a story about the one that got away, usually involving a fish the size of your leg and a broken line. You never saw it, but you believed him. And on the days you did catch something, even if it was just a bluegill the size of a cookie, he would hoot and holler like you had just pulled up Moby Dick. You would sit there side by side, quiet except for the occasional snack or Dad humming an old tune. But if you want to hear about the reward after a good fishing trip, let me take you to the drive-through dairy farm. Glass bottles, cold milk, and maybe even ice cream. Oldsmobile was the brand your grandfather trusted. It was dependable, steady, and proudly American. In the 1970s, it was one of General Motors' most successful lines. The Cutlass was everywhere. Parking lots, driveways, high school graduation gifts. It was a badge of middle-class confidence. But times changed. Japanese automakers brought new efficiency. The luxury market moved to BMW and Mercedes-Benz, and Oldsmobile struggled to define itself. Was it sporty? Was it classic? Was it for young drivers or retirees? The answers never came. Designs grew stale. Performance lagged. The name Oldsmobile started to feel like a joke no one wanted to explain. By the time they rebranded, no one was listening, and the name started to sound old. By the 1990s, Oldsmobile felt like a brand out of time. Sales dropped. Dealers lost faith. General Motors tried to rebrand it, update it, give it a new face. But it was too late. The final Oldsmobile rolled off the line in 2004. For decades, it was the quiet heart of the American road. And then it was gone. Not with a crash, but with a sigh. A slow fade into silence. And if you ever drove one, you remember. The smell of the vinyl seats, the hum of the engine on a long drive. Oldsmobile did not just fail, it retired. W.T. Grant was not just a department store, it was a part of the American landscape. In the 1970s, it had over 1,000 locations, main streets, suburban malls, strip centers. W.T. Grant was everywhere. It sold clothes, appliances, hardware, school supplies. You could buy a pair of jeans, a toaster, and a lawn chair in one trip. But behind the counters, trouble brewed. Management wanted growth, and they wanted it fast. Stores were built too quickly. Debt piled up. And worst of all, they handed out credit like candy. Their revolving charge account let customers buy now, pay later, with no real system to check if they could afford it. The trust they gave customers was generous, but fatally blind. W.T. Grant did not just run out of money, it ran out of time. The losses mounted. In 1976, W.T. Grant filed for bankruptcy. It was one of the largest retail collapses in American history. Thousands of workers lost jobs, communities lost familiar storefronts, and shoppers lost a place that felt like home. Unlike other stores that faded quietly, Grant's collapse was loud, public, and painful. It was a warning shot across the bow of American retail. Grow too fast, trust too much, and the walls will fall. People still remember the logo, the way the floors creaked, the smell of new shoes in a cardboard box. But the store itself is gone. Canned Vienna sausages were soft, salty, and kind of weird. But they worked. You popped the lid and pulled out a row of pale, jelly-covered mini hot dogs packed tight in mystery water. They smelled like a meat factory and looked like baby food for adults. But you ate them cold with crackers or fried them in a pan and called it breakfast. They were cheap, portable, and weirdly satisfying. Each sausage was the size of your finger and had the consistency of room-temperature butter. You could not slice them without squishing them, but you did anyway, because they were meat, and meat was meat, especially when money was tight. You found them in discount stores, food pantries, and packed in your lunchbox when there was nothing else. They did not require refrigeration, which made them a pantry MVP, and no matter how questionable they looked, you were always glad they were there. They came in pop-top cans with paper labels that peeled off in the heat. And no matter how many times you gagged at the first bite, you always finished the can. They lasted forever in the cupboard. They showed up during hurricanes, blackout dinners, and those long weeks before payday. Canned Vienna sausages were not loved, but they were there. And when you had nothing else, that was enough. He never bought a thing, and we never needed a thing. But the appliance store on Route 17, that was a showroom of dreams. The moment you stepped inside, it was like the future had been laid out under fluorescent lights. Fridges the size of Cadillacs, dishwashers that promised miracles, and those clunky microwaves that looked like they could launch satellites. Dad would do the full lap, hands in pockets, nodding like he understood the specs. "Now this here's got dual defrost," he would say, which meant absolutely nothing to any of us. Meanwhile, you were just there for one thing, the donut samples. Right by the scratch and dent section, on a little fold-out table with a paper plate and toothpicks stabbed into sugar-dusted treasures. If you got lucky, there might even be coffee, lukewarm, but still free. Sometimes a salesman would corner Dad, and he would nod solemnly, asking questions like he was running a restaurant and not just trying to keep the toaster alive for another year. It was never about buying. It was about imagining. About standing in front of a top-of-the-line freezer and picturing your name on the deed to a better life. But when it came to good times and cheap thrills, nothing froze time quite like the local bowling alley. Once upon a time, Schrafft's was the place to be. Polished silverware, waitresses in crisp uniforms, and menus with elegant script. It was high-end dining for the everyday person, a little treat, a step up from the usual. But by the time the 1970s rolled around, that old-school glamour had started to feel, well, old. Schrafft's was famous for its desserts, sure, but it also had charm, chandeliers, tablecloths, and a vibe that made you want to mind your manners. The food leaned classic. Turkey dinners, creamed spinach, and lemon meringue pie served with pride. For decades, it catered mostly to women, shoppers, lunch dates, special occasions. And it worked. But the world changed. Fast food was rising. Counter service was in. Schrafft's stayed stuck in the past, clinging to formality while the rest of the dining scene loosened its tie. Younger diners saw it as their grandmother's restaurant. Older customers stopped going out as often. The customer base aged, and the company never adapted. Even when Schrafft's tried to modernize, adding lounges, slimming menus, simplifying service, it felt too little, too late. The essence of the brand had already slipped away. One by one, locations closed. And soon, all that remained was a faded memory of chocolate sundaes in chilled glass cups and servers who called you ma'am. Schrafft's did not fail because it was bad. It failed because it stood still while everyone else kept walking. There was a time when TWA meant elegance, A time when stepping onto a Transworld Airlines flight was like entering a luxury hotel in the sky. The seats were wide, the service crisp, the logo iconic. From movie stars to newlyweds, everyone wanted to fly TWA. It was part of the golden age of air travel. But by the 1970s, the clouds were darkening. Deregulation hit hard. New competitors raced into the skies, offering faster routes and cheaper fares. Fuel prices soared, labor disputes dragged on, and TWA's once glorious reputation began to buckle. What once felt like flying with royalty now felt outdated and expensive. Suddenly, the airline of tomorrow had become yesterday's news. It expanded too quickly, bought too many jets, and could not keep up with the ruthless economics of modern air travel. Bankruptcy became a familiar word. By the time American Airlines absorbed what remained in the early 2000s, the brand was already a shadow. Airports removed the signs, crews traded uniforms, but the memory lingered. For anyone who flew TWA during its heyday, there was nothing like it. Now, it is a name buried under decades of debt and nostalgia, a ghost with wings. If any of this reminded you of what used to sit on your shelf, or what still might, share your favorite memory in the comments, tap like if it brought you back, and subscribe so we can keep unpacking the past together.